And now it's time for Mob Talk Radio with your host, Jeff Canarsie.
Here is a bulletin from CBS News. In Dallas, Texas, 3 shots were fired at President Kennedy's motorcade in downtown Dallas. The first reports say that President Kennedy has been seriously wounded by this shooting. This picture has just been transmitted by wire. It is a picture taken just a moment or two before the incident. If you can zoom in with that camera, we can get a closer look at this picture. From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time.
This week, which is the Kennedy crime family. I think we're on part 3. This is not going to be as long-winded as last week's show, but it's long-winded to the extent that we're going to be talking a lot about film stuff. And this is really going to take Joe Kennedy right up through the 40s. And then a bunch of stuff is going to happen. But this is an important part because, like I told you, behind every great fortune is a great crime. So last week we talked about Joe Kennedy and his early dealings, taking over as a bank president at a young age and pushing himself into bootlegging and supplanting himself and his ships into business. Through wealthy friends and politicians, he would be able to put himself into positions of power at an early age, which obviously would be a stepping stone to something much bigger down the pike. The Kennedy wealth came from some parts hard work, but it also came from those connections that P.J. Kennedy established early on with both sides of the Kennedy family, including the in-laws, the Fitzgeralds, being political heavyweights. They really had come forward 3 generations very early. And what I mean by that is what would have taken the Kennedy family 3 generations to establish wealth and stature, it only took 1 generation. People like the Fords, the Rockefellers, those are the families whose wealth was amassed in 1 generation and then just quadrupled over the ensuing years. And pretty much it was the same thing for the Kennedy crime family. Joe Kennedy learned early on that positions of power are the end goal. Those positions avail you many things, right? They especially can for the tide to stay low for as long as you need it to stay low to do what you have to do. And if you sort of catch my drift there with that sort of analogy, Joe Kennedy learned that the rules did not apply to him at all as long as he controlled those voting on the rules, and those making the rules were his friends. And this is what the upper crust of society in this country has always been about. Kennedy was no different in that way. And I'm sure looking back, if Kennedy completely was driven by wealth, I think rather Kennedy wanted to be not just someone, but he wanted to be the one. He wanted to take the family further than his father, P.J., ever could have envisioned. He was setting his sights on something much bigger than his father ever could have dreamt of. So last week, we left off with Kennedy basically going to work for Bethlehem Steel, and he gets a job through others based on his reputation. He then would get into the stock business with Hayden Stone and basically learn to stock swindle, do insider trading, and a lot of people lost their wealth as a result of Kennedy. Keep in mind, at the time, the stock exchange didn't have any oversight at all. So Kennedy wasn't really technically doing anything illegal at all, but it certainly was definitely fucking immoral, which Kennedy had no problems about. You're going to find out next week that when the stock exchange finally gets overhauled and they put rules in place, who do you think makes the rules and is running that? You guessed it, Joe Kennedy. But we'll talk about that portion of it next week. So Kennedy would form a new business called J.P. Kennedy Banker, and it was an investment company that was started in 1923. His specialty was short selling. So in other words, his investments double if the value of the asset fails. He would borrow assets. Now, keep in mind, he owned his own fucking bank. Those assets would have been securities such as shares and bonds, and basically he would sell them. Kennedy would then purchase the same number of the same type of securities in order to return them to the lender. If the price plummets in the meantime, the investor, whom Kennedy was, would make a profit equal to the difference. So in other words, if you want the price to plummet, you want everything to fail and drop badly because that's how you make your fucking money. Kennedy wasn't borrowing money from anybody but himself. Remember, he owns the keys to the bank. When you own a bank, you can do whatever the hell you want with zero oversight from the government. Nobody could stop him. These days, that sort of shit would get you life without parole. Think Bernie Madoff here. A short seller can incur a liability to the lender if the price rises. And because a short sale is normally done through a broker, a short seller is typically required to post a margin to its broker as collateral to ensure that any such liabilities can be met, and to post additional margin losses, and to post additional margin if losses begin to accrue. So who was the broker for Kennedy? Himself. He risked nothing either way. In 1929, we know the stock market crashes. So who became a millionaire as a result of that? Well, you guessed it, Joe Kennedy. Well, everybody else lost everything. He gained everything. But this serpent, because that's exactly what the fuck he was, had more ways to manipulate and gain more wealth. Prior to the market tanking, Kennedy formed a business with other Irish Catholics. He joined forces with Bernard Smith, Michael Meehan, and Charlie Mitchell. They would establish a stock pool to control trading in the stock of glassmaker Libby Owens Ford. That arrangement drove up the value of the pool's operators' holdings in the stock by using insider information and the public's lack of knowledge. They then bribed journalists to present favorable news concerning stock. So in other words, let's use journalists. We're going to talk about how great this fucking stock is. Everybody's going to buy. We know it's going to fucking plummet. Hooray, hooray, hooray. Fuck them. That was basically Kennedy's MO. As a result of these favorable news articles, it drove the stock up or down depending on how Kennedy and his company wanted the stock to go. So if they wanted to make a killing and sell out high, they could do that. If they wanted to plummet the shit, they could do that too. So Kennedy and his cronies also would end up getting into a bidding war with Yellow Cab Company. As a result of those actions, Kennedy becomes a multimillionaire. So during the Great Depression, Kennedy amassed a wealth of $63 million in 1929 alone. 6 years later, he would be worth $3 billion. That's insane. And obviously I added inflation. Okay. So in 1929 alone, $63 million. 6 years later, $3 billion. And much of his wealth would come from bootlegging, like we've talked about, and the stock market fraud, pump and dump schemes, and insider trading. With amassing a great deal of wealth, Kennedy begins to look west. And by west, I mean Hollyweird or Hollywood. The FBO, or the Film Booking Office, was a registered company which was FBO Pictures Corporation. They mainly were an American film studio during the silent era, the golden age of filmmaking. And it was produced and distributed mainly low-budget films that nobody wanted to fucking watch. The company began in 1916 as an Anglo-American import-export company known as Robertson Cole. So they began distributing films in December of 1916 and would open up a production studio by 1920. However, they just weren't making any money. And what was actually happening was they were hemorrhaging money very badly. Now, prior to Kennedy getting involved, Kennedy had actually acquired New Hampshire and Maine Theater Company, which was a small chain of New England-based movie houses. It's through that company that he began to look out west, not just to distribute movies, but he wanted to control movies. Importing was great, but if he could control it, the real money was in production. So when he was with Hayden Stone, which was the firm that taught him how to swindle stocks, he ends up meeting a British firm which controlled the majority ownership in Robertson Cole. The British firm was looking for an American buyer because Robertson Cole, like I said, was hemorrhaging money very badly. But let's step back because I want all of you to understand the mechanism here of what Robertson Cole really was. So as we said, the company was founded in 1918 by Harry Robertson and Rufus Cole. I love that name. Rufus. What's your name? Rufus, motherfucker. Their headquarters at the time were based in London and New York City, and the company basically initially handled American-made trucks, cars, automobile accessories, Bell and Howell motion picture equipment, and some other stuff. And their initial film focus was on distribution of Northern European, South Asian, and Latin American markets. From the United States office, they used the moniker RC Pictures and started American Motion Picture Distribution in 1918. They would end up purchasing film rights from independent production companies, and then they would sell them to exhibitors, Mutual Distributing, which was the successor to Mutual Film Studios. They purchased films starring Susi Hayakawa, who was a Japanese star, and he was a model, and he used his own production company called Hayworth Pictures Corporation. Other companies would get on board and make films specifically made for RC, including BB Features, Jesse D. Hampton Productions, National Film Corporation, and Winsome Stars. They also would acquire serials and shorts. In January of 1920, Robertson Cole would purchase Hallmark, which enabled them to distribute films to which they owned the rights, including in-house productions. So back in those days, you couldn't just make a film and distribute them yourselves. You had to literally go through a distribution company. So in other words, you had to own the rights to your films in order to distribute them, and included in-house production. So it was a good way for them to go. So in March of that year, they would reform the company into Robertson Cole Distributing Corporation. They would slate 25 movies to be in theaters around the country. They would brand their top films Superior Pictures, and their first feature would be The Third Woman, starring Carlisle Blackwell and Louise Lovely. Sounds like a fucking porn name. Next would be The Wonder Man, starring boxer George Carpentier. The problem was Robertson Cole needed a film studio. In June, they would acquire 15 acres in California in the Cole Grove District, which was really just adjacent to where Hollywood stands today. They would then purchase 450 acres in Santa Monica for just exterior shooting. In September of that year, they signed a deal to have 8 sound stages built. But they just kept losing money. And at first, Joe Kennedy is actually brought in to oversee the finances of that company as a favor. And this is sort of how Kennedy learned the ins and outs of film financing and production costs. So to help facilitate Robertson Cole, Kennedy would form a company called Robertson Cole Distribution Company of New England. It allowed Kennedy to handle the film business in an area where he had a controlling interest. It was Kennedy's way of controlling the market in New England, ensuring that the company that he was looking out for got good deals, and low distraction fees applied. So in other words, he was stacking the fucking deck. He knew what he was doing. He's like, okay, well, if I own all of this and I push it into an area where I own turf and territory, nobody can say no. So we'll at least get the name out there. We'll build the brand, and then I'll try to take everything over, which is basically what Kennedy does with every business he ever owns. So in 1921, Robertson Cole's first big production comes out. The title was The Mistress of Shenstone, directed by Henry King and starring Pauline Frederick, who was a former headliner with the famous players Lasky and Goldwyn Pictures. At the time the film came out, the company was in debt over $5 million from the building costs and other incidentals. Because banks were unwilling to loan money to a lot of different film companies, they were actually forced to deal with people that would give them the money, but at 18% interest on every dollar, which is fucking insane. Just an insane interest rate. Now, the primary investor of the company, which was Graham of London, reached out to Joe Kennedy to ask him to help them find a buyer. In turn, this is what they do. Just to go to Joe Kennedy and ask him to look over the finances and just to find an American buyer, they give Kennedy a seat on the RC board. This is crazy. They pay him a 6-figure salary as an advisor's fee, plus a huge percentage of the commission. Kennedy would go and try to find a buyer, but he couldn't find one. So what Kennedy does is he offers to buy 25% of the company, but they turned him down. And that was that. In 1925, Kennedy pulls the move. He forms a group consisting of Guy Currier, Louis Kirstein, who was the chairman of Filene's, for all of you New Englanders like myself, John Fitzgerald, yes, Kennedy's father-in-law, and together they offered $1 million to purchase the renamed FBO. The offer for $1 million was rejected, but after a few months of watching more and more money going down the drain, they accept the offer from the Kennedy Company for $1.5 million. This is where it gets kind of good. So days after acquiring FBO, what do you think Kennedy does? What do you guys think is the first fucking thing that Joe Kennedy does? Yep. You may not guess it, but he forms the Cinema Credit Corporation, and that becomes the lending company and financing company for all of Hollywood films. So with film distribution companies being able to distribute film to exhibition companies, Kennedy knew they would be facing an uphill battle getting their films seen. And with them in the way of Kennedy pushing his films or future projects, he does what many of you are probably going to expect that he does. It's hostile buyout time. He moves into KAO, which was the Keith Albee Orpheum Corporation. With the KOA Corporation, they owned basically a bunch of vaudeville motion picture theaters in the United States and within Canada. They had a total of, I believe, 1.5 million seating capacity and controlled 700 theaters in the U.S. and Canada. So this is where the rub comes in. Kennedy's a shrewd little fuck, let me tell you. Kennedy would then buy a controlling interest in KOA, which more or less was a smart move because he knew that if he controlled a ton of theaters along with the Maine and New Hampshire theaters and controlling FBO and owning a percentage of KOA, it meant that he had basically a monopoly on movie houses. Therefore, his shitty grade B films that nobody would really ever watch, which were independent, would actually be seen by a lot of people. Whereas if he just simply owned FBO, he would have had an absolute hell of a time getting those films to even in those theaters. So by 1927, Kennedy would then buy the controlling interest in Path Exchange, which was a production studio. He would then merge Path with Cecil B. DeMille's Producers Distribution Company, Corporation. So in simpler terms, Kennedy just bought controlling interest to control the narrative. Anything he could buy to box people out, he would do. Kennedy would pack up his family and they would end up moving from Boston to Riverdale, New York. And by the time he picked up his family and moved, obviously he has a shitload of kids, which included Rosemary, Eunice, Kathleen, Patricia, Robert, John, and Jean. In 1926, he pretty much becomes a studio owner. It was his first full year into films. He was able to get FBO on good financial standing by using his bank to settle all of those debts owed. Kennedy knew while he might have some advantages over others, albeit financially, he also knew that he wasn't going to be taken seriously by actual filmmakers and producers or critics. So what does Joe do? He sets up a series of so-called film lectures, to bring people out to discuss the business and creative aspects of filmmaking at Harvard. Now, Kennedy is, he's really fucking, he's a scumbag. This is great. So Kennedy invites wealthy, influential people to come to this thing, right? And it basically was a smokescreen for Kennedy to appear as if he knew what the fuck he was doing, because he knew he needed affluence and he needed wealthy backers to invest in films. So here's what he does. He hires a series of people to give these lectures. But all of these lectures were written script form and handed to men who had little or no knowledge of the film industry whatsoever. And if anything, only had a elementary school education. So basically went out and hired fucking bums to read off a script to make himself look better. And he believed that Harvard, by having these lectures at Harvard, brought him validity. And if Harvard had any kind of issue with these men who weren't proficient in anything, let alone the alphabet, they were all forgotten after Kennedy made a huge donation to Harvard, a 6-figure donation to establish the Joe Kennedy Film Library. What a prick. It was once again smoke and mirrors for Kennedy. That was the same type of behavior he employed when he needed stocks to rise. The same way that he would use journalists to validate his stocks to create a surge, he would use Harvard as the backdrop for his films. Many powerful men within the film industry were invited to these lectures, and that was also by design. Kennedy wanted to impress them, to gain a foot in the door in the industry, and it would work. And he fooled them all. In 1927, Kennedy wanted to advance his standing in Hollywood. He gets a meeting with RCA head David Sarnoff, with RCA being the innovator of the photophone, which was the system that was being employed for the sound system that they were using for now talkies. RCA needed inroads into Hollywood. They needed to sell their stuff. RCA needed a foot in the door to sell all of their systems. And at the time, Kennedy knew he needed to get with the new, and by making talking pictures was where he needed to be. That was the future. And Kennedy needed access to this equipment. So at the time, Warner Brothers had the Vitaphone, which had become pretty much the standard that was set in place. So obviously RCA is going to be a competitor. So Kennedy somehow aligns himself at the meeting with RCA, and he combines that with FBO. Now, all controlled Kennedy theaters would use the photophone. Others seeing this had to deal with KOA, and that's how KOA happened. So while you might say, hey, Jeff, this is all good, but where's the illegal shit? Well, I thought you'd ask. A part of the deal with Kennedy buying any company is that Kennedy would lowball, and then he would pinpoint companies who were badly in debt who needed an influx of cash. They would let Kennedy buy in for a low percentage or a 25% sort of thing. And then he would say the first order of business after this transaction took place is that I am fully in control of this company. That's just what Kennedy did. He was a bully. Kennedy purchased them on the premise of, let me just help you out. And then basically said, I'm controlling it. What I say goes, and you have no fucking choice or else. So in 1928, Kennedy was controlling 4 different companies, FBO, KAO, combined together. RCA, happy with Kennedy, bought into KAO. And in 1928, they combined all of that bullshit into one big merger called RKO. And that's how RKO is founded, and that's how it becomes a subsidiary of RCA. So they formed the juggernaut, and Kennedy and Sarnoff made a ton of fucking money on the merger. So right after that, Kennedy attempts to buy the Pantages Theater Company. You guys are going to love this shit. This is so Kennedy type of shit. So he attempts to buy Pantages Theater Company. He offers, keep in mind what his initial offer is, because what he fucking does and what he ends up doing is a lot less than this. He offers $8 million to the company, which in today's value would be $126 million. Now, Pantages at the time didn't even want it to sell. They didn't want to sell at all. They were successful and they didn't need Joe Kennedy. So they refused to sell and basically tell him go fuck himself. Kennedy, who's not happy about this and doesn't like to be turned down, he refuses his film-owned productions to be shown at any Pantages theater. And suddenly, Pantages wasn't getting any films from anybody anymore. Kennedy put a stop to it. And there seemed to be a boycott on Pantages for some reason. They were getting all like grade B and grade C films when they were getting all of the top films. And then suddenly, something even more fucked up and sinister happens. The head of Pantages, a man by the name of Alexander Pantages, suddenly gets arrested and charged with rape. Pantages claimed he never met the girl in his life, and many believed and still believe that Kennedy in fact framed Pantages and hired the girl to make up the false rape claims. Pantages, fearing prison, agrees to let Kennedy purchase the company for a lot less than Kennedy offered before. They settled for $3.5 million, which is about $55 million in today's money. So $125 million versus $55 million. So Pantages ends up going on trial. And the first thing that happens is a mistrial. During the second trial, which Kennedy, for some odd reason, kept coming to, allegedly handed an envelope to prosecutors outside, and suddenly their case just didn't go anywhere. The girl who was the one that was allegedly raped, a girl by the name of Eunice Pringle, confessed years later it was Joe Kennedy who contacted her and paid her to frame Pantages. Even decades after, she was actually given a polygraph, which she passed, still claiming it was Joe Kennedy who was behind every single bit of that. Kennedy had no problem framing anybody who didn't want to get in line or get on board. So through Kennedy, other people, you're gonna love this. You're gonna love this part too. At the end of this episode, you're gonna be like, Jesus, Joe Kennedy was a fucking scumbag. Well, it's gonna get worse next week. But through other people, Joe Kennedy ends up meeting Gloria Swanson. Swanson, obviously, who was a prolific star during the silent era. She had a lot of financial issues, right? She tried to set up her own production company called United Artists Corporation. And a lot of the issues is that she was just a handful. She spent way too much money and put her personal life ahead of her business. Kennedy ends up meeting Swanson, and the two began a torrid love affair. And Kennedy seeing not only could he bed a famous starlet, he somehow talks her into allowing him to control her finances, and he promises her that he would make her a star again. He would form Gloria Productions to oversee her filmmaking opportunities and all of her finances. Not only was he controlling her life, but all of her finances and all of her film contracts he handled. In 1928, Kennedy would hire Erich von Stroheim to direct Swanson in a lavish film designed to restore her career. The title of this film was by the name of Queen Kelly, which was the titled name of the film, but it never really comes out. And a lot of that is because at the time there was like this really big thing with censorship, and Kennedy knew what could be passed through censorship and what couldn't, but somehow, for some odd reason, had a script developed and forced the director to film borderline porn scenes, which Kennedy knew would never, ever fucking pass the censorship. And there was a bit of a bigger ploy actually going on behind the scenes. Not only was Kennedy having a torrid sexual affair with Swanson, but Kennedy was also pilfering money from her account and off of her name. The next film, Love of Sonia, which Kennedy produced with Swanson, bombs. Swanson wasn't getting what she wanted and started to feel used. The culmination of the end of their relationship was when she discovered that all of the expensive gifts that Joe Kennedy was giving to her, he paid for with her money. What a scumbag. What a prick. Many over the years speculated that he and I think it's pretty accurate, that he used Swanson for her name and for her contacts. And he basically used her to meet others and used her name to propel himself into the limelight. Kennedy had other torrid affairs, and those wouldn't stop. And eventually he gets word that the market's going to crash. And this is kind of going back to the stock market for a second. He gets word that the stock market's going to crash, and he quickly starts moving stock as quick as he can. And two things are about to happen. Number one, Prohibition is about to end, and the market's about to crash. And I know we touched a little bit on the crash last week in the beginning of this show, but Kennedy seemed to have a massive amount of insider information, and he sold all of his stock just prior to the market crashing, and many have speculated that Kennedy helped create the market to crash to begin with to gain millions. It's been alleged that Kennedy, Rockefeller, and GM owner William Durant had extensive meetings about the stock market a few months before the market would actually crash. According to many, Rockefeller and Durant told Kennedy the market was going to come crashing down and told Kennedy to sell off all of his stock in RKO and other withholdings immediately, and then to turn around and use short sell stocks. So in other words, get rid of everything that you own, turn it back into net losses, and we're going to make millions together. And that's exactly what happened. And Kennedy was one of three men who made $100 million off the stock market crash. The mafia, for their part, including Sam Giancana, ranted at length about the market crash decades later, saying that Kennedy and Rockefeller and Durant manipulated the entire crash. And, while that's sort of a tall order, but somehow I've always said where there's smoke, there is fire. So Kennedy ends up selling out of Hollywood, makes $100 million during the crash, and considering he is pretty much out of Hollywood, he needs to start making more moves. The end of Prohibition is coming, and you're not going to believe the shit that Kennedy starts pulling right before Prohibition ends. And we're going to stop right here today, and the reason is because there's a lot that's going to take place in the next 5 years for Joe Kennedy. There's going to be a big meeting between some of the biggest bootleggers on who gets to keep what territory when Prohibition ends. There's going to be a turf cut taking place, and Kennedy somehow gets one hell of a deal. And with the amount of money that he makes from controlling lucrative booze companies, he's about to expand into narcotics, and he's about to expand into gambling. Kennedy is also about to use an old friend, a new political machine by the name of Roosevelt, to gain even more power. Roosevelt, turns out, is the guy who somehow got the medical clearance for Kennedy to get those medicinal licenses to import booze. So when we come back next week, it's going to get really, really interesting as Kennedy gets deeper and deeper into white-collar crime and begins to use his he begins to use his wealth and his power and his affluence to put himself into political positions. But he's going to end up fucking himself due to his love of Adolf Hitler and his hatred of the Jews. And it's about to get really fucked up really quick. So come back, join us next week for the 4th installment of the Kennedy Crime Family. And welcome back to Mob Talk Radio. We are going to get into the credit. I'm fucking getting loopy. It's a long show today. We're going to get to the Kennedy Crime Family. So last week, we spoke about Joe Kennedy and everything that he had been doing in the past. His present was looking very fortunate. He had made millions when the stock market came crashing down, inflating the stock in many companies, and then once hitting that 20% profitability, he would sell off the stock along with his little buddies, and the stock would bottom out, and they would make millions while everybody lost seemingly everything. Secondary to that, he would make millions and dump it into real estate because right after the crash, it was truly a buyer's market, and Kennedy didn't hesitate tossing millions and millions of dollars into properties. And as we mentioned, he had headed out to Hollywood, and we know what he did there. If he couldn't buy you out, he'd frame you. I mean, it's as simple as that. He made close to $80 million in 3 years alone out in Hollywood. And Kennedy sort of becomes tired of the Hollywood scene, but he never grew tired of banging Hollywood actresses, which is something that his sons would share with him, as Bobby and Jack would also bed many Hollywood starlets. John Kennedy, this is disgusting, John Kennedy even slept with Gloria Swanson too. And he literally asked her which Kennedy was better in bed. Your father nailed her. What the fuck is wrong with you? And that's some revolting shit. I can't imagine Kennedy after the act looking at Gloria Swanson and, who's better, me or daddy? That's fucking gross. But anyway, Kennedy, who wanted an inroad into politics, sort of begins to move in that direction. And it wasn't the political machine that he liked. It was the influence that politicians carried that Kennedy wanted. He just wanted power. He wanted to be known as a rule maker, somebody who could control the narrative. Ego was a huge thing with Joe Kennedy. If friendships couldn't buy him what he wanted, money could, as well as alliances. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was the guy that Kennedy wanted to hitch his wagon to. Roosevelt had won an election in New York State Senate in 1910. President Wilson would appoint him Assistant Secretary of the United States Navy in 1920, and then he would be he would also be the Democratic nomination for vice president in 1920. Roosevelt would suffer from polio and really would never regain full use of his legs, and in 1928, he would win the nomination for governor in New York. Kennedy and Roosevelt, they knew each other well from the early days, especially the shipyards. Roosevelt and Kennedy really didn't get along, to be honest with you. And they often butted heads, and Roosevelt especially didn't like Joe Kennedy's crooked bullshit. He just didn't like it. In fact, Roosevelt had sort of a long hostility for Joe Kennedy after World War I because Kennedy tried to sell unused warships, making them into streamliners, and Roosevelt refused to allow it, which created sort of a schism between the two men. On more than one occasion, Roosevelt and Kennedy almost came to blows over some of Kennedy's underhanded shit and his ego. As a result, as we know, Roosevelt becomes the front runner to become the president, and Kennedy would go on to hold huge nonstop fundraisers for Roosevelt. And I'm sure that made Roosevelt very uncomfortable, but Kennedy goes all out getting the elite to fund Roosevelt. And like I said, I'm sure Roosevelt took the money, he needed it, but Roosevelt's political beliefs didn't align with Joe Kennedy's beliefs at all. Kennedy wasn't helping Roosevelt because he was the best man for the job, but rather Kennedy wanted a seat within the cabinet of Roosevelt. Kennedy couldn't win an election on his own if he wanted to. He couldn't get into politics because his beliefs were too fucking wacky. So rather than attempt to try to run, why don't I get in a motherfucker's cabinet and then surreptitiously from the inside destroy everything and then try to run for office? And I think that's what Kennedy essentially was trying to do. It was the only way into politics without having to actually run, and to have to face some of the more sultry things that he had done in the shadows wasn't good for him. Bad optics. So in 1932, Roosevelt wins the election and becomes the president. If Kennedy thought that he was going to be given a seat within the cabinet for all the little side work he was doing, he would be totally wrong because Roosevelt totally ignored him after the election. Thanks for the money. Go fuck yourself. When Roosevelt took over, the country was really kind of fucked up. There were 13 million people that were unemployed in this country, and almost every bank was either closed or busted out, except for Joe Kennedy's for some odd reason. In 1935, the country was sort of beginning to gain steam again, but bankers and investors were not happy with Roosevelt because of his New Deal program. Roosevelt was allowing deficits in the budget, adding taxes to the wealthy, new controls over banks and public utilities, and it infuriated Joe Kennedy because who's that going to directly affect? Him. So while this was going on, Kennedy just further expanded into properties, and then he would purchase what we know today as Hyannisport, and he would buy controlling interests in the Hialeah racetrack in Miami. So here we go. So Al Capone had resettled down in Miami in 1927. In fact, one of the problems that Capone had at the time was showing how he was getting his money. He knew the government was looking into his finances, and he had heard help that they were going to start looking at him for tax evasion and stuff like that. And he wants to buy a house, and you can't buy a house because you have to prove where the money comes from. And Capone needs help purchasing the compound in Palm Isle. Capone from Florida was controlling brews. Oh my God. He was controlling booze, prostitution, and gambling from Florida into Chicago and things in actual Florida itself. It was through subsidiaries that Capone's purchasing of his home came through a bank called Columbia Trust. You guys remember Columbia Trust? Who owns that bank? Joe Kennedy. It was through friends that Kennedy somehow was able to get Capone a loan, even though he knew that the IRS was looking into Capone's finances. And what he does is he incorporates that loan so that the financial obligations to that payment never come back to Capone whatsoever. Not long after Capone arrives in Florida, Tony Accardo arrives, Jake Guzik arrives, Frank Nitti arrives. Following that, Joe Adonis, Lucky Luciano, Frank Costello, and Meyer Lansky. Not long after Lansky arrives, he takes over fucking everything in Florida. In 1931, we know that Al Capone finally gets clobbered with tax evasion, and he's heading off to prison. So track betting gets legalized in Florida in 1931. While Kennedy might have had a bit of a financial stake in Hialeah, the reality is the mob controlled everything in Miami at this point, and it's just another argument from my point of view to the authors who say the Kennedys had zero organized crime ties. It's just another long list of affiliations that we're going to talk about. So as we said earlier, even with Kennedy's wealth, right? Even with his wealth at stake, he still backs Roosevelt, even though Roosevelt wants to do the New Deal that's going to fuck him over. He also, what he does, and this is a pretty slick fucking move by Kennedy, he brings, he basically brings in William Randolph Hearst, who is obviously a newspaper magnate. it was good for business. But eventually, as we would know, Hearst becomes a Nazi sympathizer, just like Joe Kennedy. And he would, Hearst would actually become one of Roosevelt's biggest fucking enemies in the world. But for now, they used Hearst for good press to help Roosevelt. So in 1933, Roosevelt, who was the new president, Joe Kennedy and Roosevelt's son James head to Europe. And the reason for this trip was because Prohibition eventually was going to start to come to an end. And everybody knows that Joe Kennedy was pretty much tipped off that this was going to happen. And of all people, he takes Franklin's son, James. I mean, come on. So obviously Roosevelt knew he was going to end Prohibition. And why not stack his friend's deck in his son's pockets too? And that's all this is about. Kennedy truly wanted to monopolize companies exporting booze from Europe, right? So Kennedy already had those deals, many of them already in place since his father had owned multiple companies, which sort of get handed down to Kennedy. But Kennedy really wanted to advance his holdings in other companies. So Roosevelt basically sends his son with Kennedy because he knew that even if Kennedy was a fucking bastard, he knew how to make money. He saw it as an opportunity for his son and himself to make millions of dollars. Somehow, and this is going to be a big debate for the rest of history, but many believe that Kennedy used James Roosevelt and his dad's pressure. But Kennedy somehow obtains the rights, you're going to love this, to become the U.S. agent for Haig and Haig Limited. Now, keep in mind, Prohibition has not yet ended, and somehow Kennedy is over there acting as the U.S. agent for when Prohibition does end. And it's obvious that Kennedy gets that position in power through Roosevelt. So he not just becomes the agent for Haig and Haig, but for John Doerr and Sons and Gordon's Dry Gin. But how did Kennedy just simply get those deals? Dun, 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 dun. It came from one guy. His name, Winston Churchill. Churchill obtained a lucrative amount of stock in two U.S. companies controlled by Joe Kennedy and his associates in an apparent pay-to-play arrangement around the same time that Kennedy receives British approval to ship Scotch whiskey and other liquor to America. The two U.S. companies were national distillers. Joe Kennedy was its New England liquor franchise owner, and a privately owned New York subway company, then controlled by Kennedy and another business associate by the name of Bernard Baruch, who was a longtime Churchill ally in America. The secret liquor deal was orchestrated on an October 1933 trip to England by Joe Kennedy and Jimmy Roosevelt that included a meeting with then financially troubled Churchill at his English estate, Chartwell Manor. As part of this arrangement with Kennedy, Jimmy Roosevelt also secured the insurance contract for the liquor shipments between America and Great Britain. Kennedy wound up making millions and millions of dollars from this British liquor deal once FDR signed the legislation ending Prohibition in December of 1933. Joe Kennedy later sells his liquor company in 1946 for millions and millions when his son, John F. Kennedy, first runs for Congress and begins his march to the U.S. presidency. The reason why he does that is because he does not want to be tied to any illegality and have it fall back on his son. And it's not like you can just hop on a boat and say, okay, this is what I'm going to do. He had to be handed the ability to do these things. Once again, it's another instance of Kennedy using his friendships to his advantage. And the Churchill and the Kennedy crime family relationship would last for decades. Not 4 decades, literally 40 years. And how do we know that that's true? Well, shortly after Kennedy returned from England with the British liquor contracts, Churchill sends a telegram to Kennedy's business associate, Bernard Baruch, who also was a longtime friend of Churchill. And this is what the telegram says. I have a printout of it. It says, I bought 700 Brooklyn, Manhattan, barrels around 30, sold for 100 around 35, and I am sitting on 300, Winston wrote to Baruch on October 15th of 1933, shortly after entertaining Kennedy at his mansion. Many thanks for the fruitful suggestions. I have copies of these telegrams anyway. No, that's just me. Sorry I wrote that. Let me read this again. I bought 700 Brooklyn and Manhattan barrels around 30, sold 400 around 35, and I'm sitting on 300. So here they are discussing business. And all Kennedy is doing here is actually patting the deck. He's stuffing the mattress because he knows he can control the flow of scotch and gin now. And once Prohibition officially ends, he's going to be in control of everything, and everybody is going to have to deal with him. December 5th of 33, Roosevelt ends Prohibition. Prior to the end of Prohibition, Kennedy met with mob leaders in New York City, which included Frank Costello, Meyer Lansky, and others to cut up turf. The reason for that was because everyone wanted to monopolize the legalization, and nobody wanted Kennedy to have a monopoly over distribution. But what Kennedy would offer them for keeping the routes would be keeping the routes open and giving them a cut rate price on booze, which was cheaper than they would get if it just came over here. And he mentioned that they could avail of themselves, his ships, for whatever they might need, and the mob would agree. So turf gets split up among the mafia, and Kennedy kept his turf and his routes. Kennedy would officially form his Somerset Importers prior to the end of Prohibition, and actually had already been, prior to that, importing barrels of booze, as we discussed last week. All Kennedy is doing here is cornering the market. Even though he had full control of the booze market, his true ambition or focus, despite many ideas, was he wanted to be an influencer in government. He wanted to control the government. Any expectation of working, like I said earlier, in Roosevelt's cabinet might as well have been flushed down the shitter. But Roosevelt wasn't stupid. He knew that it would be a mistake bringing him in to let him sort of be in his cabinet because of Kennedy's ties. However, Roosevelt also realizes that he needs to keep Kennedy happy because of what Kennedy's capable of. And for some fucking insane reason, he names him the chair of the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, in July of 34. What's hilarious to me is the fact that it was Kennedy's specific job to basically police Wall Street, which Kennedy had taken advantage of. Kennedy was placed in charge to make sure that nobody could do exactly what he did to attain his wealth. Talk about hypocrisy. The newspapers were criticizing Roosevelt specifically for this move because everybody knew exactly how Joe Kennedy had obtained a lot of his wealth. And newspapers gave the impression that Kennedy was a one-man army policing Wall Street. So when President Roosevelt's aides asked him why on earth he would hire Kennedy to oversee the SEC after Kennedy had basically cheated his way to wealth, Roosevelt smirked and said, "Send a thief to catch a thief." So regardless of the optics, Roosevelt was smart enough to know that Kennedy knew everything about selling and pump and dump schemes and all the tricks of the trade. And behind his back, he would instruct the SEC team to keep a close watch on Kennedy, which included Supreme Court Justices William O. Douglas and Abe Fortas, and instructed them to help bring order to the chaotic industry. Under Kennedy, the SEC had four missions, so to speak. The first point was to restore investor confidence in the securities markets, which had collapsed on account of its questionability and the external threats supposedly posed by anti-business elements in the Roosevelt administration. Secondly, the SEC had to remove penny anti-swindles based on bad information, fraudulent devices, and get-rich-quick schemes, all things that Kennedy had done. Third, more important than the frauds, the SEC had to end the million-dollar maneuvers in major corporations whereby insiders with access to high-quality information about the company knew when to buy or sell their own securities. A crackdown on insider trading was essential. Finally, the SEC had to set up a complex system of registration for all securities sold in America with a clear set of rules, deadlines, and guidelines that all companies had to follow. The main challenge faced by the young lawyers was drafting a precise set of rules. Kennedy would feed new information about the reforms to the SEC and to the newspaper, whom at first seemed to scratch their heads with his appointment to the SEC, they now seem to be in favor of Kennedy. And a lot of that had to do with Kennedy paying them off to report good things. Very similar to the early days when Kennedy knew how to use the newspapers to gain public adulation. Kennedy knew it didn't matter what the government or the president thought. It was public's perception. That was the most important thing. Public perception was everything to the Kennedys and always would be. And if you need an example of that, look at the British royal family and sort of how they handle things. Their existence depended on public perception. And they have always controlled the newspapers for the most part in Britain to some extent. And now you see with Prince Harry, not that I'm trying to get into all of this, but you see with Prince Harry coming out and telling everybody point blank that there's a mutual understanding between the royal family and the media, and that he complained about his wife, Meghan, was being treated by the media in Britain. But it turns out that all of those nasty things were being planted by the royal family themselves. It's the same move that they made against Diana when she wouldn't bend at the knees for him. Same sort of mechanism. Think about it. All the affairs, all the crimes, never really came out, right? And it's because they knew how to grease the wheel. Kennedy was no different. Even though Kennedy was given a 5-year contract to control and oversee the SEC, he actually leaves the SEC in 1935, a year into his control. From the end of 35 to 36, Kennedy would go on to act as a consultant for business and government. For 6 weeks in the fall of 1935, he heads to Europe, and he reports back to Roosevelt about the financial situation in Europe. He would then head to the United States and would become a paid advisor for RCA head David Sarnoff. Paramount Pictures would then hire Kennedy as a business advisor to look over their records and to review their books and their business plans. In 1937, Kennedy is named chairman of the U.S. Maritime Commission, and he gets that job through Roosevelt. His only experience was running the shipyards. So the United States Maritime Commission was an independent executive agency for the U.S. federal government that was created by the Merchant Marine Act of 1936, which was passed by Congress on June 29th of 36, but would be abolished in May 24th of 1950. The commission replaced the United States Shipping Board, which had existed since World War I. And basically it was intended to formulate a merchant shipbuilding program to design and build 900 modern merchant cargo ships to replace World War I vintage vessels that compromised the bulk of the United States merchant marines, and to administer a subsidy system authorized by the Act of offset the cost differential between building in the United States and operating ships under the U.S. flag. These ships were intended to be chartered or leased to U.S. shipping companies for their use in foreign seagoing trades, for whom they would be able to offer better and more economical freight services to their clients. Another facet of Kennedy's position within the commission was to revitalize America's deteriorating commercial fleet and to broker peace with, ready for this, with and within the tumultuous maritime unions. Now, historically, what we do know is by 1937, Lucky Luciano goes to prison. Vito Genovese has fled New York to go back to Italy to escape murder charges. With Luciano in prison, Frank Costello, who had told people that Kennedy was active in bootlegging, had also said that Kennedy was the biggest criminal he ever fucking met. And Kennedy also made sure shipments reached Frank Costello on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, about a block from where I'm at right now. Those unions, these maritime unions, all of the unions were controlled in Red Hook. They were controlled in Jersey City. They were controlled in Manhattan. And I think we know by now who ran those unions. Sox Lanza, Louis Lepke, Meyer Lansky, Albert Anastasia, Anthony Anastasia. They all controlled the docks. They controlled those unions with brutality. In those early days, Anastasia controlled Brooklyn with an iron fist. Manhattan at the time was mainly Irish-controlled, especially with ILA President Ryan. President Ryan handled mob business for the Italians with kickbacks. Ryan's number two, Emil Camarda, dealt directly with Anastasia himself. The Bowers gang, who was dominating Manhattan docks above 42nd Street, and the O'Mara gang was running Chelsea. From there, the Dunn-McGrath gang took over. Across the water, Jewish mobster Charlie Yanowski held a firm grip. Sox Lanza had a grip on Lower Manhattan. And mob bosses made use of the workers' desperation to walk off with entire shipments of valuable cargo and used, unions to snag lucrative shipping contracts. Renegade longshoremen sometimes whisked away particularly big shipments, luxury goods like furs, alcohol, or raw materials like steel for the mob, while the Union bosses conveniently lost the ship's paperwork or any record of cargo arriving on the dock. People have estimated that the mob made $100 million a year through its organized thievery just on the docks alone. So in 1935, a guy by the name of Pietro Panto, who was the ILA organizer, gets a call from Union leader Emil Camarda, who was also tight with Vincent Mangano. Panto has been warned repeatedly that he should stop trying to shape up the docks he was asked to meet, and he's never seen again alive. A year later, his body is found in a New Jersey marsh. It would be the first murder that Abe Rellis would get information about to the feds. It's one of 60 murders that Abe Rellis would talk about. So we know as early as 1939, the mob controlled the docks, but in reality, that had been going on for decades before. So once again, I reference this because a lot of people who make claims that Kennedy had no involvement with the mafia are full of shit. Kennedy knew who ran those docks. And as we said earlier, during Prohibition, he used those very docks, specifically the docks right over here on the Lower East Side, which was controlled by the mafia, to send shipments of booze. Sox Lanza in 1919 organized the Seafood Workers Union. At age 20, he does this, the Local 202. He incorporated them as the Fulton Market Watchman and Patrol Association on behalf of Joe the Boss Masseria, and then later for Lucky Luciano and Vito Genovese. So once again, you know, the idea that Kennedy had no idea this was going on it's laughable to me. So in 1936, Luciano, obviously we know, goes on trial for pandering. He ends up in prison. Vito Genovese would flee to Italy, avoiding those murder charges. And with Luciano in prison, he names Frank Costello the boss of the family. And it's Costello who had dealings with Kennedy. He accepted deliveries from Kennedy on the Lower East Side. So once again, to say Kennedy had zero relationships with organized crime is a joke. Costello became the way station of sorts with direct contact to Joe Kennedy. And it's worth noting, just as a little side dish, that in the late 1950s, both Kennedy and Costello met once a week for lunch in New York City. They took meetings together once a week. Denials by authors and the Kennedys over that, it's disputed by witnesses and photos. But we have to go back to 1929 for a second because something takes place that directly dealt with booze and indirectly with Joe Kennedy, or more directly. So remember that we said 1929 was a huge financial gain for Joe Kennedy. Keep in mind, we talked last week about where Kennedy was at this time. He was out in California, right? Mid-stroke into his film foray, right? You guys are going to love what I'm about to tell you. So what I have in front of me is Kennedy's ledger printed out from that time period. And Kennedy was missing in action between May 13th and May 16th of 1929. Kennedy's ledgers were to the minute, his schedule, everything. And I guess in the old days, that's just what people did. They just wrote down everything that they did. In his ledger, it shows Kennedy as taking a few days off with no meetings scheduled. Keep in mind, every other time this motherfucker has written down where he's going, what he's doing at what time. At that time, Kennedy was working on a new film that would be coming out under his RKO Productions. And for him to take a couple of days off is just a little strange. While the ledger does not state where he was, he left a phone number where he could be found for the days during this entry. The area code is 609. Do you guys want to look up area code 609? I'll wait for a second. Go ahead, look up 609. Let's give you a second. Area code 609, look it up. That area code is from New Jersey, specifically Trenton, Lawrenceville, Princeton, Medford, Wildwood, Cape May, Ocean City, Burlington, and Atlantic City. So, my little mobologists, do you guys know what took place May 13th through the 16th of 1929 in Atlantic City? Anybody have any good guesses what that could be? How about the Atlantic City Conference? Do you guys remember exactly what that meeting was all about? Who was there and why they were there? And I will say this. And obviously, we're going to stop right about here and bring it back because I don't want to go to what this meeting was about today because it's huge. But let's just say this. In May 13th through the 16th of 1929, the Mafia has a conference in Atlantic City. Those in attendance were Johnny Torrio, Lucky Luciano, Frank Costello, Joe Adonis, Vito Genovese, Albert Anastasia, Frank Scalish, Vincent Mongano, Tommy Lucchese, Willie Moretti, Meyer Lansky, Bugsy Siegel, Louis Lepke, Jacob Shapiro, Charlie Workman, Longies Willman, Dutch Schultz, Oni Madden, Frank Erickson, Al Capone, Frank Nitti, Jake Guzik, Frank Rio, Frank McErlane, Waxy Gordon, Harry Stromberg, Max Hoff, Erling Bitts, Charlie Schwartz, Mo Dalitz, Lou Rothkopf, Leo Berkowitz, Abe Bernstein, Joe Bernstein, Charlie Solomon, John Lazia, Santo Trafficante Sr., Sam Silverdollar Carralla. And there was one other guy who was in attendance. There was one other guy who was in attendance in some portions of that meeting who would have an important role to play, considering one of the huge topics at this meeting was actually bootlegging. The mob wanted bootlegging wars to stop. They also wanted diversification and investments into legal liquor ventures. They wanted expansion of illegal operations to offset profit loss from the probable repeal of Prohibition, and reorganization and consolidation of the underworld into a national crime syndicate. Those were the big things they wanted to talk about. They needed a source overseas. They needed someone who could help them. Someone who had ships. Someone who had unfettered access to the ocean, to the ports. Someone who could bypass the Coast Guard, for example. And there was only one man for that position. And that man was a rich, Irish, arrogant prick named Joe Kennedy. So next week we begin by talking about the Atlantic City Conference. And we're going to discuss that meeting and what Kennedy's stake was in that meeting and how crucial he became during Prohibition, after Prohibition, and the narcotics routes. So there you have it. There you have it. So come back next week. We get some big stuff. Anyway, have a beautiful weekend, everyone, and enjoy Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin in this medley. And welcome back to Mob Talk Radio. At this point of the show, we are going to get to the Kennedy crime family. I think we're on part 5. And yes, we will be getting to the John Kennedy elections and covering all of that stuff, but not this week. So last week we spoke about Joe Kennedy and everything that was laid out before him. He had left Hollywood, but had tried to weasel his way into Roosevelt's cabinet, but that didn't work either. And eventually he, along with Roosevelt's son Jimmy, heads over to Europe. As we said last week, he got pretty much in bed with Winston Churchill, and through Churchill was able to wrestle control of Doors, Gordon's, Hagen, and other companies. It simply meant when Prohibition was repealed, which it would be, that Kennedy had a market on importing booze from Europe. Jimmy Roosevelt was along for the ride to get wealthy, and don't think that President Roosevelt didn't gain something out of that either. Roosevelt knew Kennedy was a fucking scumbag on every level, but, I never met anybody who said that money smelled, who didn't shove it in their pockets. So Kennedy used the power of the president not just to attain medical licenses, but also to use the power of the president just to get special conditions, and even got himself head of the Maritimes, which to the mafia was like the goose that laid the golden egg. One of the aspects that I want to address, because invariably one of you is going to ask, how can the Kennedys say that Joe Kennedy had no organized crime contacts, especially when Joe was seen with Frank Costello and others, and his date book backs up what we've long suspected. They've always spun Joe Kennedy as a financial wizard and a moneymaker, a deal maker. Think Donald Trump. However, Trump is not and never has been a deal maker. He used daddy's money to attain his wealth. Trump is not a bright guy. Trump was handed his first $5 million from daddy and was an epic failure for most of his life. And I'm not getting into the whole political side of that, but Trump is one of those guys whose name does sell. Well, it used to anyway. But Trump's businesses have always been in the red, not quite the massive success story that he's been trying to sell you and everybody else for years. And this is why Trump has fought so hard to hide his taxes, because it's going to show massive losses. And to somebody like Trump, whose ego is based on money, cannot keep the lie going about how wealthy he actually is, when factually it can be proven how much in debt he truly is. Just facts. So I make that comparison between Joe Kennedy in the same way, but the difference is Joe Kennedy actually made millions, but not from an honest point of view. He was a fucking criminal. So off goes Joe and Jimmy to settle the booze contracts, and that's when Roosevelt decides to end Prohibition. His son and Joe have completely, essentially cornered the market. They kick back to Winston Churchill, who can acquire permits for them, and less eyes on the ports in Europe. And those are just facts. Just for dates' sake, Kennedy and Roosevelt went to Europe months prior to the repeal of Prohibition, which Prohibition came into effect, or the repeal of Prohibition came into effect December 5th of 1933. Now, the Maritimes, Kennedy didn't take over till 1937, so I don't want anybody to get confused there, but we will touch on narcotics stuff at some point. There was also some belief that Kennedy was involved at some point with the IRA, which is a bit of a leap. But in any event, 1929 was a horrific year for the mafia. February 14th of 29, Lincoln Park, Chicago. Al Capone ends the life of 7 rivals and one of the bloodiest, most publicized hits in American history. And we will know this as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. That hit, designed by members of the Capone group, wanted to remove stalwart Bugsy Moran from the booze wars and wanted to basically take full control of the north side of Chicago. While both sides had been going at it for years, it was the theft of booze by Moran's group, barrels of whiskey coming down from Canada through the Detroit River, which infuriated Capone, who from Florida ordered those murders. On that very morning, Peter Gusenberg, Frank Gusenberg, Albert Kalachek, Adam Heyer, Reinhard Schwimmer, Albert Weinshank, and John May were all Tommy gunned to death against a brick wall in a warehouse. Moran had long been a thorn in Capone's side and continued to rob liquor shipments based in Detroit. Something had to be done, right? So Capone made the call, and the rest is sort of history. And I don't want to revisit the step-by-step and the entire fiasco, but it was a major problem for organized crime. The cops were furious, the city was furious, and the mafia on top of it was furious. Specifically, Lucky Luciano was irate. Now, keep in mind, at the time, Luciano was just a lieutenant in the mafia and was not yet a boss, as the Castellamare War was coming, and Luciano, wouldn't get rid of Masseria and Maranzano and take over until 1931. And I wanted to say that because some may get confused as to how and why Luciano was leading the Atlantic City Conference, but was not an actual boss. And you have to remember that Masseria and Maranzano were not actually invited to that conference. And I would love to tell you how that went to be accepted, but I just don't have that answer for you. And they probably entrusted others to handle it. By contrast, Joe Bonanno wasn't invited to that meeting either because he was not trusted and he was Maranzano's number 2. So in May of 1929, specifically the days between May 13th and 16th, the who's who of organized crime would travel to Atlantic City for a big meeting. They were also there to celebrate the nuptials of the mob's financier, Meyer Lansky. The meeting was a big one because the mob needed to address what happened back in February, and they wanted the bootlegging wars to end. They didn't like the heat from police, and they also wanted to discuss what the mafia was going to do once Prohibition ended, and how could they take advantage of the booze trade once Prohibition was finally, over with. And they wanted to discuss the trajectory of organized crime and just how they would eventually move on to become a national crime syndicate. The mob knew once Prohibition ended, they would lose $1 million as a result, and how they could essentially get into legitimized liquor imports ahead of time, and how they could diversify their holdings in illegal rackets to offset the loss from bootlegging. As I said, with Lansky getting married and Luciano wanting to have a summit of sorts, they made their plans. Nucky Johnson handled all the arrangements and messages in hotel rooms. The hosts of this meeting would be Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, Lucky Luciano, and Johnny the Fox Torrio. And here is the actual guest list. Johnny Torrio, Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, Nucky Johnson, Joe Adonis, Vito Genovese, Albert Anastasia, Frank Scalish, Vincent Mangano, Tommy Lucchese, Willie Moretti, Bugsy Siegel, Louis Lepke Buckhalter, Jacob Shapiro, Charlie the Bug Workman, Longies Wiltman, Dutch Schultz, Oni Madden, Frank Erickson, Sox Lanza, Al Capone, Frank Nitti, Jake Guzik, Frank Rio, Frank McErlane, Waxy Gordon, Harry Rosen, Max Hoff, Irving Bitts, Charlie Schwartz, Mo Dalitz, Louis Rothkopf, Leo Berkowitz, Abe Bernstein, Joe Bernstein, Charlie Solomon, John Lazia, Santos Traficante Sr., Sam Silverdollar Caralla, Frank Morelli, Frank Cucciara, Sammy Lazar, and Joseph Kennedy. Cities represented were Florida, Providence, Boston, New York, Cleveland, Detroit, Kansas City, Philadelphia, Louisiana, Chicago, and New Jersey. Now, as I said last week, I cannot show you a photo of this event, okay, with Joe Kennedy there. But what I do have is corresponding dates in his books, his ledgers, and his logs, and basing that on what Kennedy was doing with the mafia already on the ports and the docks, and also with the phone number that he left where he could be reached during that specific time period, puts him in Atlantic City or right around that area. Coincidence? I think not. Remember, who ran horse tracks in Florida at the time? What did Kennedy buy down the road? Hialeah. And so I don't believe in coincidences, especially not with the Kennedys. So, like I said, there were those who were not invited. Joe Bonanno, whom nobody trusted, was not invited to the meeting. And the reason was because he was Maranzano's number 2, and nobody trusted that he would keep his mouth shut. As we've always said on this show, Luciano and others never really fully trusted Joe Bonanno, and his waffling, once the Castellamare War begins, created uncertainty in the eyes of Luciano. So Bonanno was not invited, nor was Joe Profaci, because he was another one they didn't trust. As well as Maranzano and Masseria, they were not invited either. But I really find it hard to believe that somehow word did not trickle back to them that there was a big meeting. But we'll never know. A lot of what Luciano and Torrio wanted to express was that the old world beliefs and the ethnic lines should be withdrawn. That everything was too old-fashioned and organized crime was for everyone, not just specifically Italians, which is what Maranzano and Masseria believed in. Only Italians, only Sicilians, nothing else. They hated Frank Costello because he was Calabrian. So one of the first things discussed at this meeting is what led to the vicious murders in Chicago. And while they understood the principles involved in the turf wars and the bootlegging wars, but they also felt that there were other ways to handle those problems, and that Capone had brought a massive amount of heat on everybody because of his actions. Luciano and others believed that there were other ways to handle business, and there was enough room for everyone to make money, and that the infighting in cities was a direct reason for the St. Valentine's Day massacre. Luciano would explain that Capone had acted recklessly, and he ordered that Capone, who was traveling actually to Philadelphia on business on the 17th of that month, needed to carry a gun on him and allow himself to be arrested, as law enforcement had been looking to talk to him since the massacre actually happened. Luciano expressed that law enforcement had a need for action and that Capone needed to provide that. Luciano knew Capone would take the pinch, and he would probably do a short amount of time, but it was needed for law enforcement to back the fuck off of organized crime. Capone didn't like it and argued against it, but he ended up doing what he was told, and he would be arrested in Philadelphia on the 17th and charged with concealing a weapon and would get a year in prison, but he would be out in 9 months. But that was truly, really the beginning of the end for Al Capone. Another topic at the meeting was the expansion of gambling. The mob needed ideas as to what to do when Prohibition ended. While the mob had 4 years until Prohibition would officially end, they wanted assurances from Kennedy that the shipments would continue to come in without hesitation, and the mob wanted to control whatever time they had left to Prohibition. with Joe Kennedy controlling interests of booze coming in from Europe and owning several ships and ports. It would be business as usual. They also discussed wanting the violence in Chicago to end by all means necessary, but that portion of the meeting wouldn't be that much of a concern, as Capone essentially would be done in Chicago in a relatively short period of time. So an agreement that was made was that the booze wars would completely stop. No more shots would be fired by anybody. Constant competition for importing needed to stop, and this is where Kennedy comes into play. Kennedy would essentially import everything he wanted because he had the medical license to do that, which meant that he could begin to stockpile at various warehouses. And this is one of the reasons why, when you look back at where Kennedy's warehouses were, they're found in some interesting places. Every point of contact where Kennedy owned warehouses were sort of middle sections of the map of organized crime: New York, Boston, Ohio, Detroit. From there, everything would be expanded outward, and I think we talked about that like 2 weeks ago. Anything from Canada came in through Detroit and shipped right out. Because the mafia controlled the docks, especially in New York, there were zero complications. Remember, we talked about the barrels of booze found in various warehouses, which was not accounted for, but when asked, Kennedy explained it was a storage for barrels that were owned by his banks, but not him personally. But we know that's not true because of the letters he received from his partner about the barrels being moved out to their quote-unquote friends. Another facet was discussing how the mob could pull their money together and completely control a monopoly on the booze business itself. The problem was they didn't know specifically at the time that Kennedy had moved in completely on that racket. It simply meant that Kennedy would cut back the price to the mafia because the volume would be 10 times what it normally would be. For Kennedy, there was zero risk. He controlled the narrative. The mob might have controlled everything from point B to C, but Kennedy controlled point A, and that was the most important part. Kennedy could get it to them, which is what made that relationship between them function and work so well. So without Kennedy, forget it. I mean, prior to Kennedy's help, they had issues getting everything they wanted across borders, especially from Canada. That was a big issue for them. Now, with Kennedy's and the keys to the castle, they really didn't risk anything. They knew occasionally Kennedy would rob their booze, and it just came with the territory. They were well aware he would feign false insurance claims, and that they were okay with that because it was basically Kennedy protecting himself and scamming the government, and they got their cut out of that as well. So they kind of knew that going into it. The mob also would decide that with whatever time they had left during Prohibition, that they would all begin to move into nightclubs, and that booze supplied in these nightclubs would be completely controlled by them, but the booze would be deployed or distributed by bars and restaurants specifically. We know this to be the case because Kennedy-owned scotch was being served illegally at places like the Copacabana and other famous places. So it just proves that the mob relied on Kennedy for that. If not, how the hell did Kennedy-owned booze end up in the most famous places in the city when Prohibition hadn't been lifted? So once again, it's the argument the Kennedy people make that never happened, but we know that it did. Also at this meeting, there was a discussion about tying in a national racing wire, which would be received in casinos for bookmaking and horse racing. It was basically a national racing wire for horse bettors. And the idea came from Al Capone, who explained that Moses Annenberg, who enforced the distribution of Randolph Hearst's newspapers in Chicago, could handle that. The New York and Chicago would oversee those direct operations if they went ahead with the plan. Meyer Lansky and Frank Costello were chosen by Luciano to handle those affairs for the New York side of things, and Moses Annenberg and Frank Erickson were chosen to handle the Chicago side of those things. The group would agree in principle to expand into gambling, bookmaking, and more, and it would offset any projected loss if and when Prohibition would end. They would then have a discussion to break up turf and hand over franchises and territory to others within the mafia. It was the very early beginning stages to basically form the mafia, handing over territories. If Kennedy knew when the end of Prohibition was coming, he likely didn't utter a fucking word to anybody in attendance, because it would have benefited him. It would have benefited him more to just keep quiet. It's also at this meeting that Luciano lays out the plans for the future. He explains that Masseria and Maranzano would have to go in due time, that it would take some time to get it done. At this meeting, it was decided that the Lansky and Bugsy Siegel crime family would be disbanded and that a new group would be ushered in. That group would eventually become known as Murder Incorporated, but for the time being, Luciano wanted everybody on the same page. Chicago, Detroit, Boston, and Philadelphia agreed to fully back up Luciano and New York when the shit hit the fan and Luciano moved on Maranzano and Masseria. And the rest we kind of know is history. So Chicago, Detroit, Boston, Philadelphia said, you're going to go to war, you need shooters, we'll give them to you. So everybody was in on it. So, and that also gives some clarification, too, of Luciano's decision. Remember, we talked about Sun Tzu earlier about preparation. That is preparation, knowing that I could probably do this myself, but I need to know that if it gets hairy, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different crime families in different cities going to back me. That's preparation. So while I said earlier that I can't show you a photo of Kennedy at this meeting, everything sort of coincides with what happened. Kennedy was too integral to the mafia to, one, not be there, and number two, everything I have sitting in front of me sort of proves that he was there, or at least if he wasn't sitting at the table with them, there were messages being sent, but I personally believe he was there. So, as we know, Roosevelt would end the Volstead Act, or the Prohibition Act, in 1933. Kennedy and the mafia got tremendously wealthy. Kennedy, while he had been involved in many unscrupulous things, still wanted more. He still wanted that power. He wanted to be in Roosevelt's inner circle, and was still miffed as to why Roosevelt hadn't budged and put him in his cabinet. So in 1936, Roosevelt needs Kennedy's help and needs it badly, which might as well have been the greatest news ever to Joe Kennedy. Roosevelt needed money for his campaign, he needed votes, and he just needed serious help. Kennedy would do the usual, huge fundraisers, and would even pen the biggest bullshit ass-kissing book ever written, entitled I'm for Roosevelt by Joe Kennedy. Kennedy used his contacts in Hollywood and New York to push that book. The book, which was co-authored by Arthur Kroc, who was a New York Times columnist, presented arguments for why businessmen should support Roosevelt and the New Deal. Remember, Kennedy was totally against the New Deal because wealthy businessmen were about to be held to higher standards and would likely lose millions of dollars. Kennedy's quick turnaround is pretty astonishing, but he's a snake, right? So he knows what he's doing. The book was actually told from the perspective of Joe Kennedy and his personal endorsement of Roosevelt. The book had a huge, significant impact on the business community and basically gets Roosevelt reelected. And this is why Kennedy is handed the chair of the U.S. Maritime Commission. And it's laughable because the only fucking experience that Kennedy had was running the shipyard. And remember, in those days, Roosevelt and Kennedy got into some knockdown dragouts over Kennedy's criminal shit. And basically, it just enabled Kennedy to control ships, make ships into cargo ships, which he would use for very interesting things. 10 months in, Kennedy quits. So this is a title. Kennedy threatens to have Father Coughlin whacked if he doesn't shut his fucking mouth. So here we go. Father Charles Coughlin, who was an Irish-Canadian priest in Detroit, was an outspoken critic of Roosevelt. It wasn't always that way, as Father Coughlin supported Roosevelt for a long time. However, Coughlin had a radio show where he spoke about finances and political issues and had a huge following, millions of people. And this is back in the day. So that's a huge audience. Coughlin would go on rants, much like Jeff Canarsie, bashing Roosevelt, and would have anti-communist, anti-Semitic, far-right, anti-federal, reserve, and isolationist radio rants. Roosevelt worried that the priest's nutjob antics and rants would hurt him, and he would end up sending Kennedy to speak to Father Coughlin. Whatever that conversation was, it didn't work because Father Coughlin, like I said, who had millions of listeners, swung his support for Huey Long, who was a bigger criminal than Kennedy in 1935. He then swings his prick for a guy by the name of William Lemkes, who was a Union Party leader in 1936. Kennedy, who once opposed the New Deal, was now all in favor for it and grew frustrated, as did Roosevelt with Coughlin's antics. Coughlin would go on a barrage of tirades about how the New Deal didn't go far enough and that Roosevelt was just a pawn of the wealthy. Roosevelt had heard enough. Roosevelt calls a meeting with Joe Kennedy, Pope Pius XII, who at that time was known as Cardinal Eugenio Pacelli, and Bishop Spellman. What Roosevelt wanted was the Catholic Church to shut Coughlin the fuck up, because he's going to lose the election if this guy keeps running his fucking mouth. The first thing was to get him on the same level. The first thing was they threatened Coughlin with defrocking him and throwing him out of the Catholic Church. Well, that's only going to be pushed but so far. When that didn't work, they had him removed from the air. They took him off the air. Coughlin swore then that he would speak no matter what the church, the Roosevelt, or Kennedy or the goons did. Kennedy then, once again, has to sit down with Roosevelt, and Roosevelt demands he goes and sees Coughlin and gets it into his head. Kennedy, in no certain terms, explained that if Coughlin didn't stop, there would be consequences way beyond getting tossed out of the church, and that there were ways to get him to conform or else. Coughlin would get in line, stop his rants, and then was able to return to the air in 1940. What's funny is even after Kennedy threatened him, for whatever reason, Father Coughlin would always claim he and Kennedy were friends, and he would call Kennedy the shining star among the dim nights in the Roosevelt administration. I told you Kennedy was an evil fuck. And one of the questions you might ask, considering that Roosevelt and Kennedy butted heads for years before that and years after, is did Kennedy even like Roosevelt? And I don't think he did. I think he fucking hated him. But he simply used him, and he used blackmail against him to get what he wanted. Think about what would have happened if Kennedy opened his mouth about some of the business dealings or some of the seedier side of government. It would have been a big thing if Kennedy had unveiled that he got illegal medical licenses from Roosevelt, or how he and Roosevelt's son and Roosevelt made millions and millions of dollars for illegal booze. How would it have gone down had Kennedy opened his mouth and explained how he cheated at stocks and swindled millions of people, and then Roosevelt makes him the head of the SEC? I mean, if Roosevelt wasn't if he wasn't one of the dirtiest fucking presidents besides Johnson, I don't know who was. And I get it, it's politics. And if you think that Kennedy didn't use the mob swing votes for Roosevelt, you'd be out of your fucking minds. Kennedy's power was not truly derived from organized crime, but rather the Rockefeller types. Those with the money make the rules. It's funny because, Kennedy hated Jewish people. I mean, he despised them. And we will find out in the coming weeks to what extremes he was willing to go to tell people that, which included backing up Adolf Hitler and everything Hitler was doing. Pretty crude shit, to be honest, but without the Jewish people, Kennedy could have never done half the shit that he was ever able to accomplish. It's sort of like biting the hand that feeds you. But that's who Joe Kennedy was. Nice to your face, plotting behind your back, and doing whatever he could to fuck you while you were asleep at the wheel. Roosevelt would be no different than anybody else. What Kennedy truly wanted was to be president. He wanted to control the United States. He wanted that power. And because of his lack of political acumen, he simply took the back door into politics, appearing as if he was a wealthy, intelligent guy. But the realities were that the American public had zero clue how Kennedy attained his wealth or the sheer amount of awful shit that he did to get there. So if he couldn't get inside the cabinet of Roosevelt, because largely the truth is, Roosevelt knew he was a fucking snake. But it's a snake that he needed to keep his clutches on the country. And it was worth it to him. But the entire time, Kennedy is backstabbing and plotting to overthrow Roosevelt if he can possibly do it. He just needs an opening. And the plan is simple. Back Roosevelt publicly, then admonish him behind his back to other world leaders, do whatever he could to snipe away at Roosevelt. Kennedy had what no other real president had before, and that was the backing of the most elite in this country. He had power and friends, and that power was dealt with and handled with votes. Kennedy, by proxy, could call the shots. Roosevelt, I think, at the end of the day, knew that Kennedy was a fucking scuzzbucket, but he had to keep him happy, because an unhappy Joe Kennedy, as we have seen in the last 4 weeks, meant some dangerous ass shit. The end goal was world domination. I'm not talking about New World Order or shit like that, but it was world domination. Kennedy wanted control of everything. The presidency was not enough. Kennedy's ego couldn't allow for just the presidency. He wanted to control the world. Now, some of you may scoff at that idea, but that's just the reality. The presidential nomination was just the stepping stone for what Kennedy wanted. You imagine if that prick became president and loved Adolf Hitler? Holy shit. One only has to ask, why on earth would you back Adolf Hitler? And that should be enough for most of you to say, yeah, you're right. Total piece of shit and a scumbag. So next week, when we do come back, good old Uncle Clobbercrotch somehow finagles Roosevelt into making him the ambassador to the court of St. James, which would turn out to be a fucking nightmare. Well, Roosevelt is going to run again in 1940 against Wendell Willkie. Here is Uncle Nutsy behind the surface doing everything he can to ensure that Roosevelt loses to Willie. He even tells the British press, Roosevelt will lose and he will fall badly. Making him an ambassador to the United Kingdom is the closest Kennedy is ever going to get, as he is about to destroy his legacy and any chance that he has of appearing something other than a fucking dusty criminal ghoul who just creeped out of the dirt to drink the blood of lonely virgins. Sorry, it's a little descriptive. So is Uncle Clobbercrotch. I don't know. I just find that funny, Uncle Clobbercrotch. So next week when we come back, we're going to see how good old Joey gives himself a jolly good rogering and how he destroys himself and almost destroys the country in the process. And because of all of these things he starts to do and the public humiliation he's going to suffer when he starts to go on his anti-Jewish rants, basically saying Hitler was doing the right thing, which is highly fucking disturbing. So he ruins his reputation, but he still wants world domination. He still wants to be the politically elite. He's no longer an ambassador. It becomes basically the scourge of America. But he's still wealthy as fuck, right? Still got his mob contacts. But because he can't attain what he truly wants, he has an idea. And his idea is a very simple one. I want my son to be president of the United States. Because Joe honestly believed he could control his son in the Oval Office. That's what it's all about. And I would love to tell you that John F. Kennedy had this great political backbone and he believed in XYZ and he was going to change America and he really gave a shit. But the one that was pulling his purse strings was his father. That's what it was all about. Even going back to P.J. Kennedy at the beginning, we saw the earmarkings of a wannabe politician and a scumbag, wealthy prick. And Joe Kennedy basically takes the model that PJ had and expands it in ways that nobody ever thought was possible. So next week when we come back, shit's going to get real interesting. And Uncle Clobbercrotch is going to start waving a Nazi flag. And he's going to ruin everything he's ever tried to attain. And the interesting thing is, if you know anything about the Kennedys, and Joe Kennedy specifically, that was the end of his life, for the most part. The second that he backs Hitler and starts saying stupid, awful, horrible shit, And when London starts to get bombed, he takes off to save his own family. Instead of being the ambassador, which is his motherfucking job, he corrals his whole family and they run and flee into the countryside so they can't be touched. Shows you what a fucking coward he was. And then when the Nazi shit comes to light, it's over for Joe Kennedy. But there's a shining star who came out of Uncle Clobbercrotch's nuts. John F. Kennedy. So I hope you're getting something out of the Kennedy thing. I hope you're enjoying it. Hopefully you're not going to sue me for calling him Uncle Clobbercrotch. That's a Gloria Swanson joke, I guess. We will see everybody same bat time, same bat channel